Now that we've looked at how we produce erythrocytes, we should take a look at the other end of the erythrocyte life cycle and look at erythrocyte death. What happens as erythrocytes get older is they lose strength and they lose flexibility, and then when they're trying to squeeze through tiny capillaries, they end up rupturing. Most of your erythrocytes are going to die in the spleen and in the liver because that's where you have the smallest capillaries for them to squeeze through. The liver and the spleen also have the best mechanisms for cleaning up the erythrocytes. The macrophages have the first role in cleaning up dead erythrocytes. Macrophages phagocytize or engulf the cell parts, and then they can break down the proteins. They have the enzymes necessary to break proteins down into individual amino acids. Those individual amino acids can go back into the blood and be used by cells to build more proteins. The main protein that we find in erythrocytes that's broken down is hemoglobin. And while we can break down the protein part of hemoglobin into the amino acids, we're still left with the heme cages, the heme cage that held the iron atom in the middle. That iron is pretty valuable, so we do save the iron. The iron is removed from the heme and gets transported back to the liver. Do you remember when we were talking about alpha and beta globulins in the plasma are important for helping to transport things through the blood? There is a specific beta globulin called transferrin that binds to the iron and carries it back to the liver or to the bone marrow where it can be reused to make new hemoglobin. The remaining heme cage is no longer useful. It's a waste product that we need to get rid of. That remaining heme cage gets converted to bilirubin. Bilirubin then binds to albumin, and albumin can carry it through the circulatory system until it gets to the liver. The liver takes the bilirubin and puts it into the bile. Bile is a substance that gets released into the digestive tract, and that way we release the bilirubin into the digestive tract and it can go out the far end. One of the most interesting things to talk about with any body system are the disorders, things that can go wrong. And there are a number of disorders associated with the circulatory system. One of these is jaundice. Most people are familiar with jaundice as a yellow color to the skin. The yellow color to the skin is caused by an excess of bilirubin in the blood. And there are several different things that can cause jaundice, that can cause a buildup of bilirubin in the blood, including hemolytic jaundice, which is what happens when red blood cells break down in large numbers. There's just so much heme released that's converted to bilirubin, there's more than the liver can clear out in time. There's also hepatic jaundice, hepatic referring to the liver. Hepatic jaundice is caused by some sort of a liver dysfunction, whether it's cirrhosis or other sort of liver failure. If the liver isn't working to remove bilirubin from the blood, too much bilirubin builds up in the blood and you have jaundice. Another mechanism for increasing the level of bilirubin in the blood is obstructive jaundice. In obstructive jaundice, something is blocking the flow of bile out of the gallbladder and into the digestive system. If the flow of bile is blocked and you can't get rid of the bilirubin that way, then it sort of backs up into the liver and builds up in the blood. Jaundice itself is not actually dangerous to adults. You can have a high level of bilirubin as an adult, and that isn't a problem. It is a symptom that indicates an underlying problem that may be dangerous. On the other hand, high levels of bilirubin in the blood can actually be dangerous to infants. The blood-brain barrier in an infant isn't fully formed, and it allows the excess of bilirubin to get to the neurons of the brain, and it can actually disrupt their development. So when an infant has jaundice, it's important to treat the high bilirubin itself in addition to determining the cause of the jaundice. And what I think is really interesting about the jaundice treatment is its UV light. UV light shining on the skin can break down the bilirubin in the blood and cause relief of jaundice. Another interesting blood disorder is polycythemia. Polycythemia is having too many erythrocytes. So the normal number of erythrocytes in the blood is 4 to 6 million erythrocytes per microliter. If you have more than that, you have polycythemia. We see this in the blood lab as having a high hematocrit. Polycythemia has complications due to the fact that you've disrupted the viscosity of the blood. The blood is thicker, it's harder for the heart to push, it increases the likelihood of blood clots. because the blood doesn't flow as easily, and it leads to an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. There are a number of things that can cause polycythemia, including cancer of the red blood cell producing cells, dehydration, that simply reduces the volume of the blood so the cells get packed closer together so you have more cells per microliter. And my favorite is chronic hypoxia. Hypoxia refers to a low level of oxygen. If your body experiences a chronic low level of oxygen, then your body is constantly producing more erythropoietin to try to increase the number of red blood cells, and that can lead to polycythemia. This can be seen in people with emphysema or other lung disorders who have low levels of oxygen in their blood because they can't exchange gases in their lungs very well. This can be seen in smokers for the same reason. This can be seen in athletes who engage in a high level of training. As they exercise frequently and they keep their oxygen levels low as they exercise, that stimulates the production of more red blood cells. So highly trained athletes usually have higher hematocrits than people who don't exercise. Even living at high altitude can lead to polycythemia. The higher up you live, the lower the pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, so the less oxygen you're getting into your body, and the liver and kidneys compensate for that by increasing the levels of erythropoietin to make more red blood cells. So if you were to live, say, up in Denver, you'd probably have a higher hematocrit than you do living down here at sea level. Another common blood disorder is anemia. Anemia refers to a decreased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Usually we think of this as meaning a low level of red blood cells. However, you can have anemia with a normal number of red blood cells if those red blood cells can't carry oxygen effectively. So you could have a normal number of red blood cells, but if the red blood cells don't form properly, or if they don't have enough hemoglobin in them, then you can still have anemia. The big problem with anemia, obviously, is that you can't carry enough oxygen. So low oxygen supply to the tissues, as well as reduced blood pressure and blood viscosity, are all issues with anemia. There are a number of different types of anemia based on what actually causes the reduction in oxygen carrying capacity. There's hemorrhagic anemia, hemolytic anemia, aplastic anemia, iron deficiency anemia, pernicious anemia, sickle cell anemia. All of these have the potential to cause anemia.